Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Rosewater and Cornfields. The old farmhouse did not measure time in hours but in heartbeats. It was a living museum of their love, a reliquary built of shiplap and fieldstone, each object within its walls saturated with the 63 years Thomas and Margaret had shared. The morning light, honeyed and slow, streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the worn grooves in the great oak table, a topography carved by the brush of their hands over a lifetime of meals, arguments and reconciliations. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, a scent so familiar it was part of his own blood. Yet beneath it, Thomas strained for something more elusive, the ghost of the rosewater Margaret had always worn, a fragrance now as faint and fleeting as the memories she kept locked away from him. The atmosphere was one of sacred, aching nostalgia, a silence that was not empty, but filled with the echoes of a million forgotten conversations. Thomas, at 81, moved through this sanctuary with the gentle reverence of a curator. His hands, gnarled by a life of wrestling with the stubborn Iowa soil, were now tasked with a more delicate, more desperate work, the preservation of a shared soul. Every gesture was a quiet battle against the slow, creeping erasure of his wife. He was the sole keeper of their world, and the weight of that responsibility was a physical ache in his chest, a crushing accumulation of all the small things she no longer knew. And then there was Margaret. She was turning 80 today. A queen in a faded, foggy kingdom, she sat in her armchair by the window, her gaze lost somewhere in the shimmering green of the cornfields. Her beauty had not deserted her, it had simply softened, like a photograph left in the sun. The sharp wit in her eyes had been replaced by a placid confusion, a frustrating veil he could not pierce. Her vulnerability was a constant sharp pain in his heart, most pronounced in those terrible moments when she seemed to be reaching for a thought, her hands clenching the worn chintz of the chair, her brow furrowed in a silent, agonizing struggle before the fog rolled back in, reclaiming her. He brought her a mug of coffee, sweetened with 2 sugars and a splash of cream, just as she'd liked it since 1962. "Here you are, my love," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur. She took it without looking at him, her fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic by rote. There was no recognition, no thank you. There rarely was. He did not expect it, yet the absence of it was a tiny death he experienced a dozen times a day. He sat at the table, his own mug warming his palms, and watched her. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from her parents, and the soft sigh of her breath. He began to hum, a low, tuneless sound at first, then coalescing into a melody. It was their song, a simple tune from a long-ago film they'd seen on their 3rd date, the one where he had finally worked up the courage to kiss her as they walked home under a canopy of stars. "Dream. When you're feeling blue," he hummed it every morning. It was a prayer, a ritual, an incantation. He wasn't merely hoping for a reaction. He was performing an act of remembrance, an offering to the woman who was both here and not here. He laid the memory at her feet, hoping she might stoop to pick it up. Her fingers, which had been restlessly picking at a loose thread on the arm of her chair, stilled. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He kept humming, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. It was happening. For a single breathtaking second, the placid vacancy in her blue eyes dissolved. The fog thinned, and through it, a flicker of light, of pure undiluted recognition, ignited. Her gaze shifted from the window and found his. She saw him. It was a look he had not truly received in years, a look that spoke of shared secrets and private jokes, of winter nights by the fire and summer days in the fields. It was the look of his Maggie. The connection held for a heartbeat, a fragile, shimmering bridge thrown across a vast and silent canyon. In that instant, he was not a caretaker, and she was not a patient. They were Tom and Maggie, young and invincible, the scent of rosewater and hayfields clinging to them. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The light in her eyes extinguished, the fog rolled back, thick and impenetrable. Her gaze slid past him, back to the indifferent green of the corn. Her fingers resumed their anxious picking at the thread. The moment's absence was more profound than the years of emptiness that had preceded it. It left him breathless, hollowed out. But as the shock subsided, something else rushed in to fill the void. A fierce, terrifying hope. It was a dangerous, seductive thing, this hope. It promised a miracle while threatening a deeper devastation if it proved false. But as he sat there, the melody still a ghost on his lips, he knew he would cling to it. That single flicker had been enough. It was a spark in the darkness, and for the first time in a very long time, Thomas felt the warmth of the sun. By midday, the quiet farmhouse was transformed. The air, once heavy with nostalgic silence, now thrummed with the vibrant, chaotic symphony of family. Cars lined the gravel drive, and the screen door slapped open and shut as children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren spilled into the house, their voices a testament to the life Thomas and Margaret had built from nothing but love and stubborn Iowa dirt. They brought with them the sense of perfume and grass stains, the bright colours of summer dresses, and the boisterous energy that for years had been the lifeblood of this home. Margaret sat in her usual chair, a bewildered monarch at the centre of a swirling court. She accepted hugs with a placid smile, her eyes uncomprehending, but her spirit seemingly calmed by the sheer volume of affection surrounding her. Thomas moved through the crowd, a gentle anchor in the joyful storm, his gaze constantly returning to her, gauging her comfort, her peace. His granddaughter Sarah, a young woman with Margaret's fiery red hair and stubborn chin, came to his side. She touched the small tarnished silver locket that always rested against his chest. "Grandpa, you've worn this forever. I don't think I've ever heard the story behind it." Thomas's hand went to the locket, his thumb tracing the intricate floral engraving, now smoothed by the passage of decades. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He didn't just say it was a gift. He drew the whole family into the telling, his voice warm and rich with the texture of memory. "It was the summer of '61, he began, and the room quieted, the younger generation drawn in by the rare promise of a story. Your grandmother decided we needed a proper romantic picnic. She packed a basket with fried chicken, potato salad, the works. We went down to Miller's Creek, but Maggie, well, she was never one for logistics. She'd packed the blanket right at the bottom, under everything else." He chuckled, a sound like rustling leaves. "So we're pulling everything out, balancing plates on our knees, when this big old bullfrog, must have been the king of all frogs, decides to take a flying leap straight into the bowl of potato salad, sent it flying everywhere, all over my shirt, in her hair." Laughter rippled through the room. "I was so mad," Thomas continued, his eyes distant, seeing not his family, but a grassy creek bank 60 years in the past. And then I looked at her, and she was laughing, not just a little giggle. She was howling this big, beautiful, unladylike snort, with potato salad dripping from her earlobe. And in that moment I knew her laughter was the most beautiful sound I would ever hear in my life. The next day she gave me this, said it was to remember that a little chaos was good for the soul. He looked over at Margaret, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. She was right, wasn't she, my love? Later, as the party preparations reached their peak, it was time to help Margaret dress. This was a daily ritual, but today it felt like a sacrament. He led her gently to their bedroom, The same room where they had slept side by side for over 60 years, the scent of her rosewater and his Old Spice still clinging to the curtains. He had laid out a dress of soft lavender, a colour he'd chosen specifically, remembering the wild lilacs that had bloomed with impossible fervour on their wedding day. As he helped her arms into the sleeves, his movements were slow, practiced, and full of a tenderness that transcended the simple mechanics of the task. He began to murmur the story of that day to her, a one-sided conversation that was nevertheless a profound act of connection. "The church was so hot," he whispered, his fingers finding the small pearl buttons at her back. "Your father was sweating right through his suit, but you looked so cool, so beautiful, like you'd just stepped out of a garden." He fastened the first button. "You almost tripped on your way down the aisle, remember? On a loose floorboard. You grabbed my arm and you squeezed it so tight." Another button. "And when the preacher asked if you'd take me, you said, 'Well, I've come this far,' and everyone laughed. You always knew how to break the tension, Maggie." His words were an affirmation, a quiet insistence that he still saw the fiery, laughing bride she had been, the woman who lived so vividly inside the quiet, fragile shell before him. He was dressing not just her body, but her history, clothing her in the warmth of their shared past. His meticulous acts of love continued throughout the afternoon. He found the specific Waterford crystal vase her mother had given them, the only one she ever allowed to hold sunflowers, and arranged a bright, explosive bouquet on the mantelpiece. When his daughter brought out the strawberry pie for dessert, he insisted on tasting the filling. He pursed his lips, shook his head, and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a lemon. He squeezed a final, precise amount of juice into the bowl. "There," he declared. "Now it's just the way she liked it, a little tart to cut the sweet." These were not chores. They were the physical language of their romance, the grammar of his devotion. The sensory details accumulated, the brilliant yellow of the sunflowers, the sweet and tart scent of the pie, the joyful noise of family, the soft texture of her lavender dress beneath his hand as he guided her back to her chair. He was consciously, desperately trying to build a bridge of sensation, a pathway back to her. He was willing this combination of sight and sound and taste and touch to be the key that would finally unlock the door to her mind. It was a desperate internal plea, a lover's prayer whispered not to God, but to the very universe they had created together, within the four walls of their home. The party swelled to a crescendo of warmth and affection. The great oak at the front of the house, the same tree under which they had exchanged their vows, cast long, benevolent shadows across the lawn as the sun began its slow descent. Inside, the air was thick with love, a palpable force generated by 3 generations of a family built on the bedrock of Thomas and Margaret's union. She was the absolute centre of this universe, the sun around which they all lovingly orbited, and it was in this moment of perfect familial communion that the rift appeared with brutal, heart-stopping clarity. One of the great-grandchildren, a boisterous 4-year-old named Leo, let out a sudden, joyful shriek as he won a game of tag, his voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation like a shard of glass. Margaret flinched as if struck. Her body went rigid in her chair, her placid expression shattering into a mask of pure, primal fear. Her hands flew up to her face, and a small wounded sound escaped her lips. The sudden noise had breached the walls of her fog, not with a key, but with a battering ram, leaving her exposed and terrified. The family's chatter died instantly. A hush fell over the room. Thomas was at her side in a heartbeat, his hand reaching for hers. "It's all right, Maggie. It's just the children playing. You're safe, my love." But the true heartbreak was yet to come. She pulled her hand away from his touch. Her terrified gaze swept the room of familiar loving faces, her children, her grandchildren, and saw only a crowd of strangers. And then her eyes, wide and pleading, landed on Thomas. She looked directly at the man who had loved her for more than 6 decades, the keeper of her soul, and saw a threat. Her face, a mask of confusion, conveyed a single desperate question to a stranger. "Can you help me?" For that one visceral instant, he was erased from their world. He was not her husband and not her protector, not her Tom. He was just another part of the overwhelming, frightening chaos from which she needed rescue. The blow was more powerful than any physical assault. It struck him in the very core of his being, extinguishing the fragile hope that had kindled that morning. The love he offered, the lifetime of devotion he poured out every single day, had been returned to sender, address unknown. He felt 100 eyes on him, filled with pity and sorrow. He couldn't breathe. Excusing himself with a choked whisper, he pushed through the silent family and escaped to the front porch, the screen door slapping shut behind him with a sound of shocking finality. He leaned heavily against the porch railing, his knuckles white. He and Margaret had painted this very railing a crisp white 37 years ago, laughing as they had ended up with more paint on each other than on the wood. He could feel the phantom sensation of her flicking a cool drop of paint onto his nose. The memory was so vivid it was a torment. He looked out at the great oak, its leaves rustling in the evening breeze, a silent witness to their vows, in sickness and in health. He had understood the words then, of course, but he had not understood their weight, their shape. He had imagined a sickness he could fight, a tangible enemy he could stand against. Not this slow, cruel dissolution, not this unbearable solitude of being the sole keeper of those vows. He was surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, the porch swing where they'd watched thunderstorms roll in, the garden where she'd coaxed roses from the stubborn clay, the fields he'd worked until his body ached, all for her, for them. But with her gone, truly gone from him in that terrible moment inside, the world he had built felt like a hollow stage set. The meaning had been stripped away, leaving only painted wood and empty fields. A profound, aching weariness settled over him, heavier than all his 81 years. It was a crisis of faith, not in God, but in the meaning of his own promise. What was the point of remembering if the memories only served to highlight the vast emptiness of the present? What was the purpose of a love that was offered constantly but could no longer be received? He bowed his head, the solid wood of the railing cool against his forehead, and whispered into the empty evening air, a confession to the ghosts of the past. "I remember for both of us, Maggie. I remember everything, but I'm so tired." The storm of his grief held back for so long finally broke within the supposed sanctuary of a house overflowing with love. As twilight painted the Iowa sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, the family gathered in the living room. Sarah, ever the organizer, had prepared the day's final tribute, a slideshow, a digital quilt stitched together from 63 years of photographs. The lights dimmed, and the projector whirred to life. Images flickered across the portable screen set up against the far wall. A black and white photo of an impossibly young Thomas in his army uniform, his arms slung possessively around a beaming, red-lipped Margaret. Their wedding day, standing beneath the great oak, her face a constellation of joy, the births of their children, awkward school pictures, family vacations packed into a station wagon, the years spooling out in a silent, luminous cascade. Thomas sat beside Margaret, holding her hand. Her fingers lay limp and unresponsive in his. She stared at the screen with the same vacant placidity she had worn all day, the images of her own life failing to penetrate the fog. Thomas watched, his heart a dull, heavy stone in his chest. Each happy photo was a fresh torment, a reminder of the stranger now sitting beside him. Then the final picture appeared, a recent one, taken last fall. Thomas and Margaret on the porch swing, his arm around her, her head resting on his shoulder. It was a portrait of enduring love, but also of profound loss. As the image held on the screen, music began to drift from the small speaker Sarah had set up. It was their song. Dream. When you're feeling blue. Thomas closed his eyes, the melody a sweet agony. He felt a faint pressure on his hand. He opened his eyes and looked down. Margaret's fingers were curled around his, not a twitch, but a definite gentle grasp. He looked at her face. The slackness was gone. Her brow was furrowed, her lips parted slightly. She was listening. The music was reaching her, winding its way through the tangled pathways of her mind. And then she turned her head, her gaze leaving the screen and finding his in the dim, flickering light. Her eyes were clear. The fog was gone. "Tom," she said. It was not the whisper of a ghost. It was her voice, the rich, warm timbre he thought he had lost forever. The melody that had been the soundtrack to his entire adult life. The sound of her saying his name, his real name, struck the air with the force of a thunderclap. Time stopped. The whir of the projector, the quiet sniffles of his children, the chirping of crickets outside, it all vanished. There was only the sound of his name in her voice and the impossible, undeniable clarity in her eyes. In that moment, love, pure and timeless, confronted the cruel chaos of the disease, and it won. What followed was not a miracle, but a resurrection. For 2 hours, Margaret was home. It wasn't a fragile, flickering presence. It was a cascade of impossibly specific, beautiful moments. She reached up and touched a small silvery scar on his jawline. "The old Johnson tractor," she whispered, her fingers tracing the mark. "I told you that clutch was tricky." She looked across the room at their son David and his wife. "Ellen," she said, her voice strong, "that colour blue suits you. You should wear it more often." Ellen burst into tears. Margaret's gaze found her daughter, Kate. "Is that old diary of yours still tucked away in the loose floorboard under your bed?" Kate could only nod, sobbing openly. These details were not vague recollections. They were the hard, undeniable currency of a shared life, irrefutable proof that it was her. She was here. Finally she turned back to Thomas. "Will you dance with me, Tom?" He could barely breathe, but he managed to nod. He helped her to her feet, and as their family watched in stunned, reverent silence, he led her to the centre of the room. He put his hand on her waist, and she put hers on his shoulder. Their other hands clasped, fingers interlacing in a familiar, perfect fit. The slideshow was over, but Sarah, sensing the sacredness of the moment, had started the song again. They began to move, a slow, shuffling dance that was the ultimate, holy consummation of their life together. It was a conversation held in touch and memory. His hand found the familiar, perfect curve of her back. Her head settled into the hollow of his shoulder, as if it were a space carved out by God for that exact purpose. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his neck, smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. This was not the tentative, careful way he held her now when helping her walk. This was the way he had held her at their wedding, their children's weddings, in the kitchen on 1,000 random Tuesday nights. This physical reunion, steeped in the quiet reverence of a love that had weathered all storms, was a wordless renewal of their vows. He felt the tension and weariness of the last few years drain out of him, replaced by a profound, soaring joy. He was not a caretaker. He was a husband. He was seen, known, and cherished. He finally understood that his long, weary vigil had not been a burden. It had been the most romantic act of his life. He was the guardian of her soul, and he had kept it safe until she could find her way home to it. The song ended. They stood motionless in the centre of the room. She slowly lifted her head from his shoulder and looked up at him, her eyes as clear and bright as they had been on the day they met. A small wry smile played on her lips, a look he knew as well as his own reflection. "See," she whispered, her voice full of a gentle, loving admonishment. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." The miracle did not end with a sudden, cruel finality. Margaret's light did not switch off. Instead, it receded slowly, gently like a tide at sunset, leaving behind the iridescent, priceless shells of new memories on the shore of their lives. For another hour she sat with them, her presence a soft, warm glow. Her sentences grew shorter, her focus softer, but the fear was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. When she finally drifted back into the quiet of her own mind, it was with Thomas's hand in hers, a faint, contented smile on her lips. For Thomas and his family, the resolution was profound. The aching grief that had been a constant, unspoken guest in their home was gone, replaced by a cathartic sense of peace. They had been given the ultimate gift, not a cure, but a confirmation. The woman they loved, the matriarch who had shaped their very beings, was not gone. She was merely hidden, her essence intact, her love for them an indestructible, eternal force. The slideshow and the dance had not been a farewell, they had been a reassurance. The family departed slowly, their goodbyes different from all the ones that had come before. They were no longer speaking into a void. They kissed her cheek and whispered their love to her, knowing now with absolute certainty that somewhere deep inside she heard them. Later that evening, after the last car had pulled away and the house had settled back into its familiar quiet, Thomas guided Margaret out to the front porch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and coming rain. The moon was a silver sliver in the vast, starry sky. They sat on the old wooden swing, its gentle creak a familiar lullaby. Thomas began to hum their song again, but this time it was different. He was not humming with the desperate hope of the morning, nor with the longing of a man trying to breach a fortress. He was humming with quiet, contented communion. It was a shared secret, a melody that now belonged to a new memory, the most precious one of all. They swung in silence for a long time, the rhythm of the swing like a slow, steady heartbeat. In the midst of her fog, as the last vestiges of her clarity faded back into the mist, Margaret did something instinctual, something profound. She leaned her head over and rested it on his shoulder, her body fitting against his in a perfect physical echo of their dance. Her eyes were closed, her breathing soft and even. It was an act of love that lived deeper than memory, a cellular knowledge that this man, this shoulder, this presence was home. It was the final beautiful grace note to a day of impossible grace. Thomas stopped humming and simply held her. He looked up at the great oak, its branches spread like protective arms over the house. He was still the keeper of their world, the curator of their memories. But he was no longer tired, the weight had been lifted. He was a husband who had been given back his wife, if only for a few sacred hours. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that their love was not a story contained in the past. It was a living, breathing thing, an enduring, eternal monument that even time itself could not erode. He closed his eyes, holding his love close, and listened to the quiet, steady rhythm of her heart. Steps unfinished. The grand ballroom of the Kiev Palace of Culture was a ghost of its former self, a cavern of fading Soviet-era grandeur, where the ghosts of apparatchiks had been replaced by the fierce, nascent dreams of children. The air, thick with the scent of floor wax, rosin, and the faint, clean sweat of youth, was a tangible thing. Sunlight, the colour of pale honey, streamed through towering arched windows, catching the dust motes as they danced over the parquet floor like a galaxy of tiny captured stars. The mirrors that lined the walls were vast, but their silvered surfaces were tarnished at the edges, reflecting a slightly distorted, dreamlike version of the world within, a world of disciplined bodies and untamed ambitions. In this world, Anya, at 10, was a small, fierce flame. She was tiny for her age, a slip of a thing with a coil of dark hair pinned tightly at the nape of her neck and eyes that burned with a light far too old for her years. She danced with a desperate razor-sharp precision, each movement economical and perfect. Her family had sacrificed everything for these lessons. Her talent was their only currency, their only hope for a life beyond the grim grey blocks of their neighbourhood. Every extension of her leg, every arch of her back was a testament to their unwavering faith and her relentless drive. She was a lonely child, set apart by the intensity of her focus, a girl who understood sacrifice better than friendship. Dima, at 11, was her opposite. He was tall for his age, with a natural, languid grace that made him seem boneless. The weight of legacy rested on his slender shoulders. His parents were decorated champions, their medals and trophies lining the shelves of their apartment like a shrine to a glorious past. He felt the silent pressure of their expectations, the unspoken command to follow in their footsteps, to carry the family name to even greater heights. But his soul, the truest part of him, came alive only when the music began. In the heart of the melody there were no expectations, no legacies, only the pure, unadulterated joy of rhythm and movement. He too was lonely, trapped in a gilded cage of his parents' making, his own dreams a secret he kept locked in his heart. Their coach, Madame Elena, a stern former champion whose face seemed carved from granite, clapped her hands, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. "Anya, Dima, she commanded, her voice brooking no argument. "You will dance together, the passo doble." A murmur went through the other dancers. The passo doble was a dance of fire and passion, a bullfight set to music. It required a connection, a chemistry that could not be faked. Anya and Dima had never danced together before. They were the two most promising students in the academy, but their styles were so different, their energies so seemingly opposed. They took their positions, their hands meeting for the first time. Anya's small hand was swallowed in Dima's larger one. She looked up at him, her dark eyes challenging, and he looked down at her, his grey eyes calm and steady. In that first touch, a jolt of recognition passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the shared loneliness, the shared hunger that lay hidden beneath their carefully constructed exteriors. The first notes of the music, a dramatic, almost violent flourish of trumpets and guitars, sliced through the air. And then the world fell away. It was not practice. It was a duel, a challenge, a conversation held in a language older than words. Dima was the matador, his movements bold and commanding, his body a study in controlled power. Anya was the cape, a flash of scarlet and gold, flowing and elusive, her every move a response to his. A taunt, a promise, that they moved as a single entity, their bodies speaking to each other with an intimacy that was shocking in its immediacy. The other dancers, one by one, stopped their own practice, their mouths slightly agape, their eyes wide with a mixture of envy and awe. Madame Elena, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mask of professional inscrutability, felt a rare, unfamiliar stirring of emotion in her chest. The music swelled, the rhythm grew more complex, the story they were telling more intense. Dima led, Anya followed, but it was a partnership of equals, a dance of two souls recognizing each other in the heart of the music. For those few breathtaking minutes, there was no past, no future, only the electric present, the shared breath, the sweat that beaded on their foreheads, the heat that radiated from their bodies. The air crackled with a possibility that was as undeniable as it was unbeacon. When the final crashing chord of the music faded, they stood frozen, their bodies still entwined, their chests heaving, their eyes locked in a gaze that was far too profound for their tender years. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a sacred space carved out by the magic they had just created. Then, as if waking from a dream, Dima slowly released Anya's hand. The spell was broken, but the spark, the undeniable, almost fated spark of chemistry, had been ignited. It was a fire that would burn, banked, but never extinguished, for the rest of their lives. Years passed in a montage of shared sacrifice and growing intimacy, a blur of echoing arenas, cramped overnight trains, and the endless, relentless pursuit of perfection. Their partnership became an exclusive world, a universe of two built on a foundation of trust so deep it required no words. Dima became the silent keeper of Anya's secrets, the one who knew that the fire in her eyes often masked a gnawing fear of failure. He was the one who carefully, tenderly taped her blistered toes on a rattling train to a competition in Poland, his touch a gentle comfort in the pre-dawn chill. Anya, in turn, became the guardian of his vulnerabilities, the one who saw the flicker of doubt that sometimes crossed his face before he stepped onto the dance floor. It was she who meticulously sewed a loose sequin back onto his costume moments before a final, her needle flashing in the dim light of a backstage corridor, her quiet competence a calming balm to his frayed nerves. Their lives were a tapestry woven from whispered strategy talks in the echoing hallways of arenas across Europe, of shared cheap snacks that tasted like feasts because they were eaten together, of knowing glances exchanged over the heads of judges and competitors. They learned to read each other's thoughts, to anticipate each other's moves, to communicate in a language of subtle shifts in weight, of the slightest pressure of a hand, of the shared rhythm of their breathing. Their world was the 20 by 30 metre expanse of the dance floor, and in that world they were everything to each other. The line between their art and their hearts began to blur, the disciplined intimacy of their dance seeping into the quiet moments between practices and performances, the press of his hand on her back, the slide of her leg against his, the shared breath in a tight hold. Every movement was a study in controlled passion, a slow-burn tension that was a fire banked, a love suppressed for the sake of a shared sacred dream. The fire nearly blazed into the open during a private coaching session for the rumba, the dance of love. Their instructor, a wiry, intense man named Anton, grew frustrated with their technical perfection. "Stop counting!" he barked, his voice echoing in the empty studio. "Stop thinking! Tell me the show me you cannot live without her!" His words hung in the air, a challenge and a dare. Dima, goaded, looked into Anya's eyes, and for one breathtaking minute they dropped the technique, the steps, the counts, and danced only for each other. The air grew thick, their movements charged with a raw, desperate longing that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He pulled her close, his hand splayed against the small of her back, his body moulding to hers as if they were two halves of a whole. She melted into his embrace, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, her body a pliant instrument in his hands. The story they told was not one of gentle romance, but of a fierce, all-consuming passion, a love that was both a salvation and a torment. The moment the music ended, they sprang apart, shaken and blushing, the unspoken truth hanging between them like a tangible thing. The air was thick with it, the silence deafening. They could not look at each other, could not speak. The shared dream, their pact, was the only thing that held them back from the precipice. That dream came a step closer to reality after a career-defining win at the German Open. Swept up in the glittering chaos of the awards ceremony, the flash of cameras, the roar of the crowd, the scent of victory and champagne, Dima pulled Anya into a quiet alcove behind a velvet curtain. Flushed with victory and adrenaline, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the sharp, delicate lines of her cheekbones. His eyes, dark and intense, searched hers, and in their depths she saw the reflection of her own longing, her own unspoken desire. The The kiss they had both silently craved for years was a breath away, a heartbeat from becoming a reality. But at the last second he hesitated. The weight of their shared ambition, the years of sacrifice, the sacred pact they had made, all rushed into the space between them. He rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin, and whispered the words that had become their mantra, their promise, their everything. The World Championship. First. She did not protest, did not argue. She simply nodded, her eyes closing as she savoured the bitter-sweet agony of the moment. The dream was everything. It had to be. And so they turned away from the precipice, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating in unison, and walked back into the glittering light, their love a secret fire that would continue to burn, fueling their journey to the top. The world of sequins and samba rhythms was annihilated overnight. The full-scale invasion erupted just before Dima's 18th birthday, a brutal, deafening roar that shattered the fragile beauty of their lives. The grand ballroom, once a sanctuary of dreams, became a shelter, its polished floor a cold bed for displaced families, its gilded mirrors reflecting the hollow eyes of fear. The beat of the music was replaced by the percussive terror of distant shelling, a relentless, gut-wrenching rhythm that became the new soundtrack of their lives. The conflict was no longer an abstract headline in a newspaper, but a raw, visceral reality that tore at the very fabric of their existence. It became a war of survival versus ambition, of love of country versus love of each other. The catalyst for their personal apocalypse came in the form of a missile that struck the residential street where Dima's family lived. The building was damaged, the familiar landscape of his childhood transformed into a nightmare of shattered glass and twisted metal. While his immediate family was safe, their home was no longer a sanctuary. That night, Dima, his face streaked with soot and grime, pulled injured neighbours from the rubble, his hands, once so graceful and precise on the dance floor, now raw and bloodied. The experience was a brutal awakening, a violent collision with a reality he could no longer ignore. He saw his father, a man he had always viewed as invincible, a champion, looking frail and helpless amidst the chaos, his eyes reflecting a fear Dima had never seen before. The abstract concept of defending his country became the concrete, visceral need to protect his home, his family, the very ground beneath his feet. The choice was no longer a choice, it was a moral and emotional imperative. He would volunteer. When he turned 18 in a few weeks, he would join the army. When he told Anya, her world imploded. They were huddled in a corner of the ballroom, the air thick with the smell of dust and fear. The distant thud of artillery was a constant, unnerving presence. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. For her, it was a choice, a betrayal of everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed. "They are not forcing you," she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper. "You're choosing to leave our dream. You're choosing to leave Mo for Dima." There was no choice, no other path he could take. His tio, once so alive in the music, was now tethered to the fate of his country, his family. "There is no dream if there is no home to dream in," he told her, his voice rough with a pain that mirrored her own. "There is no dance floor if there is no country to dance in." His words, meant to explain, to comfort, instead carved a heartbreaking rift between them, a chasm of misunderstanding that seemed impossible to bridge. His duty to his family, his love for his country clashed with his promise to her, his love for her. Two right but incompatible choices, two hearts breaking under the weight of a world they could no longer control. The stormy, desperate agony of a future being sacrificed hung between them, a tangible, suffocating presence. Their shared soul, once so perfectly in sync on the dance floor, was now torn in two, a casualty of a war they had never asked for, a war that was destroying everything they had ever known, everything they had ever loved. The night after his 18th birthday was a shroud of silence and sorrow. It was his last night of freedom, his last night as the boy Anya had known, before the dawn would transform him into a soldier. They met in their silent, darkened dance studio, the grand ballroom a tomb of their shared past. The arguments were over, the pleas exhausted, leaving only a profound, shared grief that filled the cavernous space like a physical presence. The moonlight filtering through the tall, arched windows painted silver ghosts on the parquet floor, ghosts of 1,000 dances, 1,000 shared dreams. The repressed emotions of a decade, the unspoken love that had been the silent soundtrack of their lives, erupted not in anger, but in heartbreaking confessions whispered into the stillness of the night. "I don't know how to dance without you," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast emptiness of the room. Her words were not a complaint, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. He was her other half, the anchor of her art, the rhythm of her soul. He turned to her, his face a mask of anguish in the pale moonlight. "Then you will have to learn to dance for me," he replied, his voice cracking on the last word. It was not a command, but a plea, a last will and testament. He was consciously entrusting their entire shared history, their future, into her hands, making her the sole guardian of the life they were supposed to live together. "Dance for us both," he whispered, his hand finding hers in the darkness, his fingers lacing through hers, a desperate final connection. The weight of his words, the crushing sacred weight of their shared dream, settled upon her, and in that moment she understood. Her love was no longer a secret to be managed, a fire to be banked, but the defiant fuel for her survival, for his legacy. Among the ghosts of their 1,000 dances, in the hallowed space that had been their sanctuary, they made love for the first and only time. It was a desperate, profound claiming, a final, sacred act of communion. Each touch was a memory being forged against the cold certainty of loss. Each kiss a promise whispered into the darkness. There was a raw spiritual depth to their intimacy, a fusion of terror, grief, and incandescent love. It was a fierce and vulnerable attempt to say what words never could, a desperate act of rebellion against the fate that was tearing them apart. His hands, once so sure and steady on the dance floor, now trembled as they explored the soft, secret curves of her body, his touch a mixture of reverence and a desperate, possessive hunger. She responded with a raw, untamed passion of her own, her body a canvas for the emotions that had been suppressed for so long. There was no artifice, no technique, only the pure, unadulterated language of two souls merging, two hearts breaking, two bodies clinging to each other in a final, desperate embrace. It was a love that was as beautiful as it was tragic, as pure as it was doomed. In making his impossible choice, Dima found a sliver of peace, a fragile, fleeting sense of solace in the knowledge that their life's work would not die even if he did, and Anya, in accepting the sacred, crushing weight of their shared dream, found a new, terrible strength, a reason to survive, a reason to dance. As a refugee in Italy, Anya was a ghost. The vibrant, passionate girl who had lived and breathed for the dance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed wraith who moved through the world as if in a dream. The dance floor, once her sanctuary, was now a torment, each note of music a painful reminder of a life that was no more. For a year she did not dance, she could not. The music was silent within her, her body a stranger to the rhythms that had once been its lifeblood. Then the news arrived, a clinical, devastating blow delivered in a crisp official envelope. Dima was killed near Bakhmut. The words were a knife to her heart, a final, brutal severing of the thread that had connected her to her past. Grief hollowed her out, leaving a vast, aching emptiness in its wake. But in the desolate landscape of her sorrow, his last words began to echo, a faint, insistent whisper that grew into a roar. "Dance for us both." His words became her resurrection. She found a new partner, a patient, powerful Italian named Marco, a man with sad eyes who understood that he was only dancing with half of her soul. He did not try to fill the empty space beside her, did not try to replace what had been lost. He simply offered her his strength, his support, his unwavering belief in the power of her art. And so Anya returned to the world of competitive dance, her movements infused with a new depth, a tragic, breathtaking beauty that silenced audiences and brought tears to the eyes of judges. The World Championship Finals. The roar of the crowd was a distant ocean, the glittering lights of the arena a blur. As she took her final bow, the victor, she held the trophy to her chest, its cold, hard weight a tangible symbol of a promise kept, a dream realized. Later, during the victor's exhibition dance, she dismissed Marco with a gentle, grateful smile. She approached the orchestra conductor and whispered a request. The first familiar notes of their rumba, the dance of love, filled the arena, a sweet, poignant melody that was both a celebration and a lament. She danced it alone, her eyes closed, her arms cradling an invisible partner. The audience was mesmerized, held captive by the raw, heartbreaking beauty of the moment. They were witnessing something holy, a love that transcended death, a dance that was a prayer, a tribute, a final, defiant act of love. As the final note faded, tears streamed down her face, a silent, cleansing river of grief and love and triumph. And in the hushed silence of the vast arena, she whispered to the empty space beside her, the space that would always be his, Ms. Mowgli. We made it. No more shadows. The town of Northwood Mills was a place of carefully drawn lines, as rigid and unyielding as the iron fences that separated the sprawling lawns of Sterling Hill from the gridded, modest streets below. For Eleanor Vance, these lines were the invisible architecture of her life. She navigated them with the quiet intensity of a scholarship student, a ghost in the fluorescent-lit hallways of a high school that worshipped names like Sterling. She was a creature of the library, of dog-eared paperbacks and the silent hum of the radiator in her small book-cluttered bedroom. This room was her sanctuary, a world away from the roaring social ecosystem of the football stadium, where the town's golden boy Liam Sterling reigned supreme. Liam was Northwood Mills' crown prince. As the star quarterback, his existence was a public spectacle of triumph and expectation. His family's name was etched onto the cornerstone of the town library he never entered, and the hospital wing his mother chaired. Yet, within the gilded cage of his life, there was a profound and secret ache, an intellectual insecurity that felt like a hollow space in his chest, a desperate need to be seen for something other than the strength of his throwing arm. This was their secret, that the two most disparate points in their town's social geography had found a common centre. Their relationship was a clandestine routine, a fragile bubble of existence confined to the four walls of Elle's bedroom. Twice a week after his practice and her library shift, his expensive truck would park 2 streets over, and he would slip through the shadows of her backyard, a silhouette against the dusk, climbing the familiar trellis to her second-story window. Inside, the world fell away. There was no Sterling Hill, no scholarship grants, only the scent of old paper and vanilla candles. Here, he wasn't the quarterback, and she wasn't the invisible girl. He was just Liam, his brow furrowed in concentration as she explained the thematic complexities of The Great Gatsby. She was just Elle, her voice soft but sure as she untangled the knots of his calculus homework. They were two halves of a whole person, her mind, his gilded cage, finding solace in the quiet space between. The spark that threatened to ignite their secret world into ash came on a crisp October night. The Northwood Panthers had just clinched the regional title in a blaze of glory. The town was electric, a current of victory running through its streets. Elle had listened to the game on her small radio, her heart thumping in time with the announcer's frantic play-by-play. A victory for him, feeling strangely like a victory for her, for them. He arrived later than usual, his face flushed with triumph and cheap champagne pilfered from a teammate's flask. He smelled of sweat and autumn air, and when he pulled her into his arms, she could feel the frantic, joyful energy thrumming through him. He was still wearing his Letterman jacket, the heavy wool a foreign texture in the soft sanctuary of her room. "We did it, Elle," he breathed into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "God, you should have been there." She smiled against his chest, a familiar pang of longing mixing with her pride. "I was, in spirit." They were lying on her braided rug, surrounded by towers of books, his head in her lap. She was tracing the line of his jaw when the sound came, the blare of a car horn, followed by a chorus of triumphant, drunken shouts. "Sterling, you legend!" Liam froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. Elle's hand stilled on his face. It was his world, the loud, boisterous, unthinking world of his friends, invading hers. A dark blue sedan, packed with his teammates, crawled past her house, their faces illuminated in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. They honked again, a long, celebratory blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of her small home. "Think they saw my truck," he whispered, his voice tight. "No, you parked on Elm," she whispered back, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "They're just celebrating." They lay in silence, two statues in the candlelight, as the car receded down the street, its noise fading into the general hum of the town's victory party. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier than the noise had been. It was thick with everything they never said, every line they were afraid to cross. He was the sun, and she was a creature of the shadows he cast. Their orbits could only intersect in this stolen darkness. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, searching hers. The bravado from the game was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He saw her, truly saw her, not as the girl who fixed his essays, but as the architect of this sacred quiet, the keeper of the only part of himself he considered real. Without a word, he closed the small distance between them and pulled her against him. The gesture was not one of triumph, but of desperation. It was a fierce, protective claiming, a silent plea for the world outside her window to simply disappear. In the flickering candlelight of the room they never spoke in, he held on to her as if she were the only thing preventing him from being swept away by the tide of his own life. The secret they shared was a constant low-humming fear, but in that moment it was also the most exquisite ache, a pocket of impossible warmth against a cold and judgmental world. The city was a sprawling, anonymous beast, and for Eleanor it was the landscape of liberation. The university campus, with its Gothic spires and sprawling libraries, was a world built to the scale of her ambitions. For the first time, she was not defined by the confines of Northwood Mills or the quiet intensity that had made her invisible there. Here, her mind was currency. She flourished, her essays earning accolades from discerning professors, her insights in seminars drawing nods of respect from her peers. She found a tribe of fellow intellects, late-night debates over coffee and poetry readings becoming the new, vibrant texture of her life. For Liam, admitted on a prestigious athletic scholarship, the same campus was an alienating labyrinth. The small-town crown he had worn so easily was worthless here. He was just another face in a sea of thousands, his fame confined to the clipped, strategic conversations of the football department. The weight of expectation was different now, heavier and colder, untempered by the familiar adoration of his hometown. Then, during a grueling pre-season practice, the trajectory of his life snapped. A misstep, a brutal tackle, and a searing pain in his knee that echoed the sound of his future breaking. The injury was career-threatening. The identity that had been so carefully constructed for him since he was a boy was stripped away, leaving him adrift in the vast, indifferent ocean of the university. Their secret meetings migrated from the warmth of her book-filled bedroom to the sterile chill of his dorm room. The space was impersonal, smelling of antiseptic and protein powder, a reflection of his own profound displacement. The cinder block walls were bare, save for a calendar of training schedules that now served as a mocking testament to a life that was no longer his. In this stark new setting, the power dynamic that had always hummed beneath their secret began to invert. Stripped of his physical prowess, Liam became deeply, terrifyingly vulnerable. The intellectual insecurity he had hidden in Northwood Mills was now a gaping wound. He was failing the complex language of his sociology and philosophy textbooks, a foreign tongue he couldn't decipher. "I don't get it, Elle," he'd confess, his voice thick with a shame she had never heard from him before, running a hand through his hair as he stared at a dense page of Foucault. "It's like they're all speaking a different language. Without football, I'm a disappointment. I'm nothing." She, in turn, became his anchor. The role was not entirely new, but its dimensions had shifted. It was no longer about helping him pass a test. It was about holding him together. She would sit on the edge of his neatly made bed, her voice a steady, calming presence as she read his textbooks aloud. Translating complex theories into stories he could understand, she helped him structure his essays, drawing out his own halting thoughts and polishing them until they shone with a clarity he couldn't have managed alone. She shared the thrill of her own academic discoveries, her passion, a small flame in the cold room, and he would watch her, his gaze filled with a mixture of awe and a quiet, desperate fear. She was no longer just his secret, the quiet girl he met in the dark. She was his lifeline. One evening, Elle was invited to read an original short story at a popular campus literary night held in a perpetually crowded coffee house called the Scriptorium. She didn't tell Liam. It was an instinctive act of self-preservation, an assumption that this part of her world, this public validation of her mind, would be as foreign and uninteresting to him as his locker room was to her. It was her victory, separate from the fragile ecosystem of their secret. But he found out. A flyer, tacked to a corkboard in the student union, caught his eye. An evening of original prose featuring Eleanor Vance. Her name, printed in stark black ink, seemed to jump out at him. That night, he put on a plain grey hoodie, pulled the hood over his head, and navigated the unfamiliar territory of the arts quad. He found the scriptorium overflowing, the air thick with the smell of roasted coffee and intellectual fervour. He stood in the shadows at the very back, his broad shoulders and athletic frame making him conspicuous even as he tried to disappear. Then she took the stage. She was wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her face illuminated by the single spotlight. She looked terrified for a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd. But when she began to read, her voice, the same voice that untangled academic theory for him in the quiet of his room, filled the space with a confidence that stunned him. Her story was a beautiful, aching thing about small towns and the secrets they keep. It was witty and profound, and the audience was captivated. Liam watched her, mesmerised. This was a version of Elle he had never seen. She wasn't his quiet tutor, his hidden solace. She was a force, a creator of worlds, admired by a room full of people who saw the brilliance he had only ever witnessed in private. The longing in his gaze was no longer just for her touch or her presence. It was a profound, humbling awe. He felt a fierce, possessive pride that was immediately followed by a wave of crushing inadequacy. Later, when he slipped into her dorm room, she was buzzing with adrenaline, her cheeks flushed. "You are incredible," he said, his voice quiet. He hadn't taken off the hoodie, as if still trying to hide. She turned, startled. You were there." "I saw the flyer." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. The air between them crackled with a new, complex electricity. His physical need for her, once the dominant current in their interactions, was now tangled with a desperate emotional dependency. Her newfound confidence was a beacon, but it also illuminated the chasm that was opening between their worlds. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His touch, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt charged with his own fragility. "I have never," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name, "been proud of anyone like I was tonight." When he kissed her, it was different from all the kisses that had come before. It was not a kiss of equals meeting in the dark. It was a kiss of pure, humbled adoration. It was the kiss of a man worshipping at the altar of a brilliance he feared he could never match. A desperate, breathless acknowledgement that she was already outgrowing the small secret room he had built for them in his heart. The slow erosion of Liam's confidence and the steady rise of Elle's culminated in a single, catastrophic moment. Liam's father, a man forged in the crucible of old money and unshakable self-importance, was a powerful university alumnus. He arrived on campus for a donor weekend, a whirlwind of tailored suits and booming pronouncements, his presence a heavy weight on Liam's already burdened shoulders. He insisted on taking Liam and a few of his old high school friends, acolytes who still saw Liam as the Northwood Panthers' immortal quarterback, to dinner at the Chantry, a restaurant whose hushed elegance and exorbitant prices were designed to make people like Elle feel they had wandered in by mistake. But by a cruel twist of fate, Elle was there. She was seated at a boisterous table with her new university friends, celebrating a prestigious scholarship grant she had just won. Her laughter, bright and uninhibited, carried across the clink of silverware and muted conversations. She looked radiant, alive, a world away from the girl who once hid in the shadows with him. Liam saw her the moment he walked in. His heart seized, a cold dread washing over him. Their worlds, so carefully segregated, were about to collide. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. A flash of surprise and joy lit her face before it was replaced by a cautious uncertainty as she took in his companions, his imposing father, the smirking faces from their past. Liam's father followed his gaze. "Friend of yours, son?" he asked, his tone laced with dismissive curiosity. "Just someone from a class," Liam mumbled, his throat tight. As they were being led to their table, they passed close to Elle's. One of Liam's friends, a boy named Mark, who had always treated Elle with a particular brand of sneering invisibility in high school, recognized her. "Hey, isn't that Vance?" Mark said loudly. "She's still cleaning blackboards to stay here?" Mr. Sterling let out a short, dry laugh. He glanced at Elle's table, at their animated, intelligent faces, and then said, with the casual cruelty of the truly privileged, "You have to admire the tenacity of the scholarship kids. They work so hard to get a glimpse of a world they'll never really belong to." The words struck Elle like a physical blow. The laughter and warmth of her celebration evaporated, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. But it was not his father's comment that broke her. It was Liam. She looked at him, her eyes pleading, searching for a flicker of defense, a word, anything. He stood frozen, trapped in the crossfire of his two lives. His face was a mask of panic and shame. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not love or loyalty, but a deep, primal fear. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent, desperate plea for her to understand, to simply let it go, to disappear as she had always been so good at doing. That tiny movement was a betrayal more profound than any shouted insult. It was the confirmation of her deepest, most fiercely guarded fear, that in the real world, the world of light and consequence, she was not his anchor, but his liability, a secret he was ashamed to keep. Elle's carefully constructed composure fractured. She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. Without a word to her friends, she grabbed her coat and walked out of the restaurant, her head held high, her back a rigid line of wounded pride. She didn't look back. The aftermath was a brutal silence. She didn't answer his calls. His frantic texts, a cascade of apologies and excuses, went unread. For 2 days he was a ghost haunting the edges of her life, until he finally cornered her on the stone steps outside the library, the very heart of her new kingdom. The confrontation was quiet, which made it all the more devastating. The autumn air was crisp, students hurrying past them, oblivious to the world that was collapsing between them. "Elle, please," he began, his voice raw. "You don't understand, my father." "I understand perfectly," she said, her own voice terrifyingly calm, stripped of all its former warmth. It was the voice of a stranger. "There is no room for me in your world, Liam. There never was. We just pretended there was, in the dark where no one could see." "That's not true," he insisted, his desperation making him clumsy. "I was scared. I'm a coward. I know." "You are," she agreed, the simple affirmation more cutting than any accusation. "But it's more than that. You are ashamed, and I will not be anyone's shameful secret." He tried to explain the suffocating weight of his father's expectations, his own weakness, the terror of that moment, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Pathetic excuses for a failure of character so fundamental it felt like a moral abyss. He had been weighed and measured in the one moment that mattered, and he had been found wanting. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, a terrible, empty sense stretched between them. "Goodbye, Liam," she said softly. She turned and walked up the library steps, disappearing behind the heavy oak doors, leaving him shattered on the cold stone. In the weeks that followed, they became what they had always pretended not to be, true strangers. They would pass each other on campus, a chasm of unspoken truths and remembered intimacies between them, their gazes sliding past one another as if they had never touched, never shared a secret world. Elle poured her pain into her work, her brilliance sharpened by a new, brittle shell of self-protection. She excelled, winning awards, earning the respect of her professors, building a life that had no space for a cowardly ghost. Liam, without her, was utterly lost. His grades plummeted, his injured knee refused to heal. The university, seeing a failing student and a non-performing athlete, revoked his scholarship. Utterly alone, stripped of his purpose and the only person who had ever seen the man he wanted to be, he quietly dropped out and disappeared, retreating from the world that had so thoroughly defeated him. A year can be a lifetime. For Eleanor, it was a period of deliberate, painstaking reconstruction. She had built new walls around the space Liam had once occupied, reinforcing them with graduate seminars, late-night study sessions, and the quiet satisfaction of her work as a teaching assistant. Her life had a rhythm, a purpose. The ache of his memory had subsided into a dull phantom limb of a pain, a thing she could acknowledge without letting it cripple her. Then, one raw November evening, that phantom limb began to throb with a terrifying immediate agony. A torrential downpour was lashing against her small off-campus apartment window, the wind howling a mournful chorus. It was a night for staying in, for wrapping oneself in blankets and the comforting drone of old movies. A sharp, hesitant knock on her door was a dissonance she wasn't prepared for. She opened it to find him standing on her doorstep. It was Liam, but a version of him she barely recognised. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead, and he was soaked to the bone, his thin jacket offering little protection. He was thinner, the easy athletic confidence that had once been his armour, completely gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, uncertain man beneath. His eyes, those stormy seas of blue, were haunted. Elle, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, the name a ghost on his lips. Her carefully constructed defences crumbled. Every instinct told her to slam the door, to protect the fragile peace she had fought so hard to win. But the sight of him, so broken, so utterly defeated, held her paralysed. She stepped back, a silent invitation, and he stumbled inside, dripping rainwater onto her worn wooden floor. He didn't make excuses. He didn't offer the pathetic apologies of the boy he had been. He stood there shivering and simply began to talk, the words pouring out of him in a torrent to match the storm outside. He told her he'd gone home, but the hollowness of his old life had been unbearable. He'd moved away, gotten a small apartment, started working a grueling construction job, his hands, once famous for their precision with a football, now calloused and rough from manual labour. He was taking night classes at a community college, studying to be an architectural draftsman, a quiet, precise art that had nothing to do with fame or glory. He told her he had been in therapy. "Losing you," he said, his voice finally breaking, tears mixing with the rain on his face. It wasn't just losing a person, it was rock bottom. It was seeing myself for what I was, a coward, a child playing a part someone else wrote for him. My father's the town's hero, but never, not once, my own man. He looked at her, his gaze raw with a year of self-recrimination and hard-won honesty. I had to build someone worthy of you, Elle, not to win you back, but because you deserve to be loved by a man, not a shadow. I had to do it for me. He choked on a sob, his whole body shaking. I didn't know how to exist in the light with you, because I was nothing but a shadow. The raw, brutal truth of his confession was a force of nature. It swept through her apartment, tearing down the walls she had so carefully erected. The love she had buried under layers of hurt and pride erupted, a fierce, undeniable current. This was the reckoning, the realization that their love hadn't failed because it was weak, but because he had been, and he had gone into the wilderness and remade himself, not for his father, not for glory, but for the quiet dignity of his own soul. She crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and her arms were around his neck, pulling his face down to hers. His first kiss was a desperate searching thing, tasting of rain and salt and a year of regret. Her hands were in his wet hair, on his face as if trying to memorize the new lines of this man who had fought his way back to her. He stayed the night. The storm outside raged, a fitting soundtrack to the tempest of their reunion. Their physical coming together was not the hurried, secret fumbling of their youth. It was a slow, transcendent act of rediscovery, a sacred, reverent exploration of the people they had become in the long, painful space between. He undressed her slowly, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of her body as if she were a precious, forgotten text he was finally learning to read. There was a worship in his touch, a humility that spoke of the profound change within him. He explored her with his hands, his mouth, with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. This was not the frantic need of a boy, but the deep, abiding communion of a man who understood the gift he had been given, lost and miraculously found again. When she touched him, she felt the changes in his body, the lean, hard muscle of a labourer, the faint scars on his hands. She was mapping the journey he had taken without her. Their lovemaking was a language beyond words, an act of ultimate vulnerability and forgiveness. It was the raw, desperate passion of their loss blended with the new, mature tenderness. It was breath and heat and the slick slide of skin on skin. It was the silent telling of secrets, the confession of loneliness, the promise of a new beginning. In the dark, with the rain drumming a soft tattoo against the glass, they moved together, a rhythm of return and renewal. It was a stripping away of all pretense, a surrender not of one to the other, but of both to the overwhelming truth of their connection. As their bodies found their climax, it felt less like a release and more like a merging, a spiritual and physical consummation that sealed the past and consecrated the future. Lying in the aftermath, their limbs tangled, his heart beating a steady, reassuring rhythm against her back, Elle knew that the secret room they had once hidden in was gone forever. They had finally stepped into the light. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, the world washed clean. For Liam and Eleanor, it was the dawn of a new, more deliberate chapter. They began again, not with the frantic, stolen moments of their past, but with the slow, tentative steps of two people learning to walk in the daylight. There were no more secrets, no more hidden rooms. Their love, once a fragile flame nurtured in darkness, was now brought out into the open air, and to their mutual relief it did not extinguish. It burned brighter. The first test came weeks later. Liam, his jaw set with a quiet determination that was more formidable than his old bravado, drove them to Stirling Hill. He walked into his parents' cavernous, art-filled home holding Eleanor's hand, his grip firm and unwavering. He introduced her not as a conquest, a secret, or an apology, but with a simple, unshakable dignity. "Mum, Dad," he said, his voice clear and steady. "This is Eleanor Vance, the woman I love." His father's initial reaction was a mask of cool disapproval, his mother's a flutter of nervous social calculus. There were questions, veiled in politeness, about her family, her studies, her plans. But Liam stood by her, a quiet bulwark, answering for himself, defining his own terms. He spoke of his new path, his passion for architectural design, his respect for the man he was becoming. For the first time he was not seeking their approval, merely stating his reality. And in his strength, Elle found her own. She met their scrutiny not with defiance, but with the calm confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. A worth that had nothing to do with her background, and everything to do with the contents of her mind and heart. They left that house not as victors in a battle, but as two sovereign souls who had declared their independence together. Liam re-enrolled in a local university, one without a prestigious football programme, pursuing a degree in a subject he had chosen for himself. His world became one of drafting tables, blueprints, and the satisfying logic of structure and design. He found a quiet joy in it, a sense of purpose that came from creation rather than competition. Elle, continuing her graduate work, became his partner in this new life. Their evenings were no longer about her tutoring him, but about them learning from each other, a true meeting of minds. Their life together found its rhythm in the small, mundane moments of shared existence. Cooking dinner together in her small apartment, their hips bumping in the narrow kitchen. Long walks through the city, their hands intertwined. Quiet evenings spent reading side by side. The comfortable silence a testament to their deep connection. They were building a home, not of brick and mortar, but of shared trust and public affection. The story closes on a warm, hazy afternoon the following spring, months after his return. They are in a public park, a sprawling green space in the heart of the city, lying on a faded quilt spread out under the dappled shade of a large oak tree. The air is sweet with the scent of cut grass and blooming magnolias. Around them the world hums with ordinary life, children laughing, a dog chasing a frisbee, couples strolling hand in hand. Liam is lying on his stomach, propped on his elbows, deeply engrossed in a worn copy of Persuasion, one of her favourites which he is reading for the first time. Elle is beside him, pen in hand, making thoughtful notes in the margins of one of his textbooks on urban planning. It is mundane, it is public, it is everything they never could have been before. He closes the book, a thoughtful expression on his face, and rolls onto his side to face her. He watches her for a long moment, a soft, wondering smile playing on his lips. She feels his gaze and looks up from her work, her eyes questioning. What is it? she asks, her voice soft. Nothing, he says. Everything. He leans over, his shadow falling across her page, and kisses her. It is a soft, tender kiss, unhurried and full of unspoken gratitude. It holds the memory of the storm and the promise of the calm. It's a kiss that expects nothing and contains everything. When he pulls back, his lips are still brushing against hers. He looks directly into her eyes, seeing not the scholarship girl, not his secret tutor, not his saviour, but the whole and complete woman he has finally learned how to love. With a reverence that makes her heart ache, he whispers, "Hello, Eleanor Vance." It is the first time he has ever called her by her full name. It is not a question, but an arrival, an acknowledgement that he sees all of her, every brilliant, resilient, beautiful part in the bright, unforgiving light of day, and he loves her completely. She smiles, a true and radiant bloom, and knows with every fibre of her being that they are finally home. The Forbidden Swing. The summer of 1869 held the Robinson estate in a verdant, opulent thrall. The air thick with the mingling scents of 1,000 roses and the sweet, clean perfume of freshly mown grass was a physical presence, a warm blanket under which society languidly perspired. It was a day for performance. The sharp crack of croquet mallets against wooden balls punctuated the polite murmur of conversations that flowed like shallow, sun-warmed streams, never daring to seek depth. Sunlight, dappled and diffused by the ancient oaks, scattered shifting patterns of gold upon the lawns, creating a scene of such curated perfection it felt almost unreal, a painter's dream of pastoral elegance. Yet, in a forgotten corner of the sprawling gardens, chaos gently reigned. An old, weathered swing, suspended from the thick bough of a gnarled oak, hung as a relic of a wilder time. Ivy, untamed and tenacious, crept up its ropes, and the ground beneath was a tapestry of moss and unruly wildflowers, a pocket of wilderness amidst the clipped precision of the estate. It was a place of secrets, a gilded cage with one corner left artfully rusted and overgrown. It was to this corner that Charles retreated. He moved through the garden party like a ghost, his thoughtful, poetic soul suffocating under the weight of expectation. His family, with their unyielding ambition, had decreed his future, a respectable, passionless career in law. The word itself, law, felt like a stone in his throat, a dull, heavy thing that would crush the life from his verses. He was a creature of shade and quiet contemplation, and the brilliant, brittle society gathered on the lawn felt like a violation. Each polite inquiry, each vapid pleasantry was a barb against his vulnerable spirit, a spirit that yearned not for wealth or status, but for a life of meaning, a life where the soul could breathe. He found the swing as if guided by an invisible thread of shared melancholy. It hung motionless, a silent testament to forgotten joys. He traced the grain of the weathered wood with a fingertip, a quiet communion with something that, like him, seemed out of place. He was not alone for long. Agnes Robinson, the middle daughter, found her way to the same secluded spot. Known for a wit as sharp as her intellect, she navigated the drawing rooms and garden parties with a composed grace that concealed a fiercely rebellious heart. She was a woman of profound thought in a world that valued only pretty phrases. The expectation that she would marry for status, a union of properties rather than souls, was a constant, simmering wound. Lord Ashworth, her father's choice, was a man whose title was his only interesting quality, and the thought of being tethered to his pompous vacuity felt like a sentence to a lifetime of intellectual starvation. She feared, with a terror that was almost physical, that her mind, her very spirit, would be locked away in the gilded cage of a conventional marriage. She saw Charles standing by the swing and paused, not wanting to intrude on his solitude, yet drawn to the quiet understanding she sensed in his posture. He looked up, his eyes, deep contemplative pools, meeting hers. "Forgive me," she said, her voice a low counterpoint to the distant laughter. "I seem to have stumbled upon your refuge." "It is a refuge for anyone who seeks it, I imagine," Charles replied, his voice softer than she had expected. "I was just admiring this swing. It feels as though it belongs to another time." Agnes moved closer, her sharp gaze taking in the scene, the swing, the man, the palpable sense of shared escape. "A freer, less complicated time," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, with a flicker of the wit that was her armour, she added, "For we were all required to give such convincing performances." The word performance hung in the air between them, a perfect gleaming pearl of understanding. It was a truth so profound, so deeply felt by them both, that it transcended the need for further explanation. In that single word, a current was established, an instantaneous recognition of kindred spirits trapped in the same elaborate play. Charles felt a loosening in his chest, a breath he did not know he had been holding. He had spent his life surrounded by people who spoke of weather and weddings, of politics and profits, yet here was a woman who spoke of the very essence of his own confinement. "I have often felt like an actor on a stage," he confessed, the words coming more easily than he could have imagined. "Speaking lines I have not written, playing a part I did not choose." "And the audience is so easily pleased," Agnes responded, a faint wry smile touching her lips. "As long as one bows at the right moments and never misses a cue, they applaud with great enthusiasm." Their eyes met again, and in that shared glance, a silent pact was made. The noise of the garden party faded into a distant hum, the world beyond their small ivy-draped sanctuary ceasing to exist. The air around the swing, already thick with the scent of roses and wild things, became charged with a new, unspoken longing. It was the thrill of discovery, the sudden, sharp joy of finding an echo of one's own soul in another. But it was a joy tinged with the melancholy of their shared reality, the knowledge that this moment of connection was a stolen one, a brief interlude in a play that would soon demand their return to the stage. For now, however, they stood in the quiet wilderness of the forgotten corner, two prisoners who had, for a fleeting moment, found the key to each other's cage. Their first meeting at the swing was not an end, but a beginning. It became their secret cathedral, a place of quiet worship in the twilight hours, after the day's performances were done. By unspoken agreement they would slip away from the drawing rooms, from the endless card games and stilted conversations, and find their way to the old oak. The world of propriety and expectation fell away the moment they entered the wild garden, leaving only the truth of their own hearts. Charles, who had never dared to share his verses with another soul, now found himself reading them aloud to Agnes. He would bring with him scandalous new books of poetry, works that defied the rigid sensibilities of their time, and in the deepening gloom, his voice would give life to words of passion and rebellion. Agnes, in turn, unlocked the secrets of her own mind. She brought her private journal, a small leather-bound book filled with astute, often cynical observations of their world. Her words were a mirror to his own thoughts, a sharp, clear reflection of the absurdities and injustices they both saw but were powerless to change. They talked for hours, their conversations stripping away the layers of polite society. He spoke of his dreams of leaving England, of finding a place where a man could be a poet without being a pariah. She confessed her terror of the impending betrothal to Lord Ashworth, a man who would value her dowry more than her mind. In the sanctuary of their shared secrets, they were not the dutiful son and the marriageable daughter, but simply Charles and Agnes, two souls yearning for freedom. One evening, a soft summer rain began to fall, whispering through the leaves of the great oak. They took shelter in a small abandoned gardener's folly nearby, a stone structure half swallowed by ivy. Huddled together in the dim, earthy-smelling space, the world outside blurred into a watercolour of grey and green. The scent of damp earth and rain-had-soaked stone filled the air, an intimate perfume that seemed to draw them closer. Agnes, her voice barely a whisper, confessed the true depth of her fear. "It is not simply that I do not love him," she said, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. "It is that he will extinguish whatever light I have within me. I will become another of his possessions, a pretty ornament for his drawing-room, my thoughts and opinions locked away like last season's gowns." In that moment of unguarded vulnerability, Charles felt a surge of protective tenderness. He saw not the witty, composed Miss Robinson, but a frightened girl, her spirit as fragile as a bird's wing. He in turn confessed his own deepest fear. "And I," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, "I will become a man I do not recognize, a creature of contracts and courtrooms, my verses buried under a mountain of legal briefs. To leave England, it is not merely a dream, it is a necessity. It is the only way I can save myself." The rain subsided, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. A few nights later, under a sky strewn with stars, Agnes sat on the swing, the wood still cool and damp from the earlier shower. Charles stood behind her, his hands on the ropes. He gave a gentle push, and she soared into the night air, a silent, graceful arc against the darkness. His hands brushed her back with each push, a touch so light, so fleeting, it was almost imaginary, yet it sent a shiver through her. The rhythm was hypnotic, a slow, intimate dance in the moonlight. The only sounds were the soft creak of the ropes and the whisper of her skirts through the still air. As the swing slowed, he brought it to a halt, his hands resting on her shoulders, his face close to hers. The world fell away, leaving only the two of them in the moon-dappled shadows. The scent of her hair, a faint perfume of lavender and rain, filled his senses. He leaned in, his heart a wild, frantic bird in his chest, and gave her a soft, hesitant first kiss. It was a taste of freedom, a promise of a world beyond their gilded cages. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, a tender affirmation of the unspoken truth that had grown between them in their secret meetings. When he drew back, the world rushed in with a startling clarity. For Agnes, it was as if she had been holding her breath her entire life and had only just exhaled. A profound stillness settled over her, a silence in which every sensation was magnified. She felt the slight tremble in his hands on her shoulders, the warmth of his breath against her cheek, the cool night air on her lips where his had been. This feeling, it was not the giddy foolishness she read about in novels. It was a deep, resonant chord of rightness, a sense of having arrived at a place she had not known she was seeking. The cynical armour she wore so expertly melted away, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, a fragile bud of hope began to unfurl. Charles watched her, his own heart a tempest of fear and exultation. In the space of that single brief kiss, his abstract yearnings had found a tangible form. She was the poetry he had been trying to write, the meaning he had been searching for. He had feared he had overstepped, that he had shattered the delicate trust they had built. But as he looked into her wide, luminous eyes, he saw not reproach, but a reflection of his own dawning wonder. The future his father had mapped out for him, the life of law and loveless duty, seemed not just unpalatable, but impossible. He could not, would not walk that path now that he knew a single kiss could hold more truth than 1,000 legal texts. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty, but filled with the weight of their shared revelation. The air around the swing, once thick with unspoken longing, now hummed with a new, more potent energy. The creak of the ropes, the scent of her hair, the warmth of his hand on the small of her back as he finally helped her from the swing. Every small detail was now imbued with a sacred significance. Their inner conflict was no longer a battle between desire and fear, but a war between a world of impossible love and a world of unbearable loss. The idyllic twilight of their secret meetings was destined to be shattered by the harsh dawn of reality. The external pressures, which had always loomed like distant storm clouds, now moved in with a terrifying, inexorable speed. Agnes's parents, with the casual cruelty of the truly powerful, formally announced their intention to betroth her to Lord Ashworth. The union was praised in the drawing rooms of Hollingford as a perfect match, a brilliant alliance of status and wealth. The words, meant to be a chorus of celebration, sounded to Agnes like the tolling of a funeral bell. Simultaneously, Charles's gilded cage began to shrink. His father, a man whose will was as unbending as iron, presented him with a non-negotiable legal apprenticeship in London to begin at once. The dream of escape, of a life of art and meaning, was to be sacrificed on the altar of familial duty. Their separate prisons were about to snap shut. The locks turned, the keys thrown away. A seed of doubt planted by the cold reality of her situation began to grow in Agnes's heart. She saw the ruin that a rebellion would bring, not only upon herself, but upon Charles. A penniless poet and a disowned daughter. What future could they possibly have in a world that valued only position and property? Her love for him, which had been a source of strength, now became a source of fear. She could not bear the thought of being the architect of his destruction. Charles, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own demons. He saw Agnes in conversation with Lord Ashworth at a formal dinner, her face a mask of polite composure. He saw her smile, a faint, distant curve of her lips, and his heart twisted with a bitter, jealous pain. He did not see the terror in her eyes, the desperate plea for a rescue she knew he could not provide. He saw only a woman accepting her fate, a woman choosing the cold security of status over the uncertain passion of their forbidden love. Their final meeting at the swing was a study in misunderstanding. Agnes, feeling trapped and desperate, tried to explain her impossible position. She spoke of duty, of family, of the ruin that would befall them both. But her words, meant to convey the depth of her love and her fear, came out sounding pragmatic and resigned. "It is what is expected," she said, her voice devoid of its usual life. "There is no other way." Charles, his own heart raw with disappointment, heard not her fear, but her surrender. He did not confront her with the passionate despair that was consuming him, but with a cold, bitter disappointment that was far more cruel. "I see," he said, his voice a shard of ice. "You are just like everyone else, after all. I should have known." He did not wait for her reply, but turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the silent, motionless swing and the crushing weight of his misunderstanding. Heartbroken, believing that Charles had given up on them, that he saw her as a creature of convention rather than a woman in love, Agnes retreated into a cold, protective shell of propriety. She attended the endless rounds of social engagements, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. She accepted the congratulations on her betrothal with a grace that was as chilling as it was flawless. Inside, however, her heart was a barren, frozen landscape. Charles, feeling betrayed and utterly alone, prepared for his departure to London. He packed his books of poetry at the bottom of his trunk, burying them under a mountain of legal texts. He resigned himself to the dull, passionless future he had so desperately sought to avoid. The vibrant, sun-drenched gardens of the Robinson estate now felt like a prison, the scent of roses a cloying reminder of a love that was lost. The air, once charged with unspoken desire, was now heavy with an aching silence, the suffocating weight of words left unsaid. The swing, their secret sanctuary, hung motionless and empty, a forgotten relic in a forgotten corner of the garden, a silent testament to a dream that had died. The eve of her engagement announcement was a symphony of polite suffocation. The drawing room at the Robinson estate glittered with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the murmur of self-congratulatory chatter. Agnes moved through the crowd like a phantom, her smile a brittle painted thing. Each compliment, each well-wishing remark, was a nail in the coffin of her happiness. She could not breathe. The walls, hung with silk and gilded mirrors, seemed to be closing in on her. With a sudden desperate clarity, she knew she could not bear another moment. Excusing herself with a murmured plea of a headache, she fled. She did not stop until she reached the wild, unkempt corner of the garden, the one place where she had ever felt free. The swing, her silent confidant, awaited her. She sank onto the weathered wood, the familiar creak of the ropes a mournful echo of her own broken heart. The tears she had held back for so long came at last, silent, scalding tracks in the moonlight. Charles had told himself he would leave without seeing her again. He had packed his trunks, arranged his travel, steeled his heart against the memory of her. But he could not go. He could not leave without one last lingering look at the place where his heart had, for a brief, brilliant moment, found its home. He was drawn to the swing by a force he could not name, a desperate, irrational hope he could not extinguish. He found her there, a small, solitary figure in the moonlight, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In that instant, all pretense shattered. The carefully constructed walls of pride and bitterness crumbled, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their love. "Agnes," he said, his voice hoarse with an emotion he could no longer suppress. She looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a desperate, fragile hope. He did not need to speak his heart. It was there in his eyes, in the raw anguish of his expression. He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides and fell to his knees before her, taking her cold hands in his. "I would rather live in poverty with you than in a palace without you," he whispered, the words a torrent of repressed longing and despair. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." "I thought you had given up on me," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I thought you believed I had chosen that." "I believed what my own broken heart told me to believe," he confessed, "and I have been living in a hell of my own making ever since. A life without you is no life at all," she whispered, her fingers tightening on his. "It is a slow, cold death." Their words, filled with months of unspoken pain, erupted into a passionate, desperate embrace. Pride and fear were burned away by the white-hot flame of their love. This was their turning point, their reckoning. To seize this one fragile chance at happiness, or to lose each other forever. He rose, pulling her to her feet. He led her away from the swing, deeper into the wild heart of the garden, to the old folly where they had once sheltered from the rain. The air was cool and damp, redolent with the scent of wet earth and overgrown ivy. Inside, the small stone structure was a haven of shadows, a secret world away from the prying eyes of the glittering house. There, on a bed of old burlap sacks that smelled of earth and time, he drew her down. The kiss that had begun in desperation by the swing now deepened into something else entirely, a slow, deliberate exploration, a silent language of reverence and need. Moonlight filtered through a high, grimy window painted them in strokes of silver and shadow. Every sound was magnified, the sigh of her breath, the frantic beat of his heart, the whisper of fabric against the rough floor. This was not a polite union. It was a sacred rebellion. A ribbon undone, a collar unfastened. Each was a barrier falling, a layer of the world they were leaving behind being stripped away. His hands, which had only known the pages of books, now learned the living poetry of her form, the curve of her waist, the delicate hollow of her neck, the silk of her skin beneath his trembling fingers. He worshipped her with his touch, a desperate and tender catechism. For Agnes, this was a profound surrender not to him, but to herself. The sharp-witted, guarded woman gave way to a creature of pure sensation. The heat of his skin against hers was a revelation, a warmth that thawed the ice that had encased her heart. She met his urgency with her own, her touch a fierce answer to his silent questions. It was a strange and holy communion, a mixture of raw sensuality and profound emotional catharsis. His mouth, which had spoken such bitter words, now whispered her name against her skin like a prayer. Her tears, once born of sorrow, were now tears of a joy so intense it was almost painful, a release of a lifetime of pent-up longing. The world outside, with its gilded cages and stifling expectations, ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this sanctuary. Their bodies, finally free, moved in a rhythm as old as the moon and tides, a dance of discovery and homecoming. It was a shattering of loneliness, a fusion of two souls who'd been wandering in the dark and had at last found their light in each other. In the quiet aftermath, they lay entangled in the shadows, their bodies still humming with the echo of their passion. His arm was a warm, heavy anchor across her waist. Her head rested in the hollow of his shoulder, her breath soft against his skin. They were no longer a boy and a girl dreaming of freedom. They were a man and a woman who had seized it. The world had not changed, the obstacles had not vanished, but they had. Their shared vulnerability had become their greatest strength. They knew now that true love was not an escape from the world, but the courage to build a new one, together. The fire of their reckoning had forged a new reality. In the cool pre-dawn light, still wrapped in the lingering scent of passion and damp earth, they made a pact. The world they had known, with its gilded cages and suffocating expectations, was a world they would leave behind. They would not be prisoners of circumstance, but architects of their own fate. Charles, with a small inheritance from a beloved grandmother, a sum he had guarded for a future he had never dared to imagine, secured passage on a ship to Italy. It was a leap into the unknown, a journey with no certain destination, but it was a journey they would take together. Under the cloak of darkness, Agnes packed a single bag. She left behind her jewels, her fine silk dresses, the tangible symbols of her gilded prison. She took with her only what was essential, a change of clothes, her journal, and the fierce, unwavering love that was now her only compass. They eloped, two fugitives from a world of comfortable misery, choosing a future of uncertainty and art over a lifetime of predictable, soul-crushing security. They sacrificed their families, their social standing, their very identities for something infinitely more precious, each other. Months later, the harsh English summer had been replaced by the sun-drenched, honeyed light of an Italian afternoon. Their home was a small, whitewashed villa overlooking the sea, its terracotta roof a warm splash of colour against the brilliant, impossible blue of the sky. The air was filled with the scent of lemons and salt, a perfume of freedom and new beginnings. Agnes sat by the open window, a sketchbook resting in her lap, her pencil moving with a graceful, confident ease. Charles sat beside her, a notebook open on the table before him, the ink flowing from his pen in a steady lyrical stream. There was no swing, but the warm breeze that stirred the muslin curtains was a gentle rhythmic push, a soft caress that whispered of the freedom they had found. He stopped writing and looked at her, his heart swelling with a love so profound it was almost painful. She was no longer the sharp-witted, rebellious girl he had met in the garden, but a woman in full glorious bloom, her spirit unburdened, her creativity unleashed. He reached for her hand, the one that was not holding the pencil, and brought it to his lips, kissing each knuckle with a tender reverence. "We are free," he whispered, the words a simple statement of a miraculous truth. She turned to him, her grey eyes, once so full of a shared melancholy, now shining with a fierce and tender love. She smiled, a slow, radiant curve of her lips that held all the joy of their new life. "We are home," she replied. Her embrace was not the desperate, clinging embrace of the folly, but a quiet celebration of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. It was a love that was both wild and everlasting, a passion that had found its sanctuary not in a secret corner of a garden, but in the wide, open, sun-drenched landscape of a shared future. They were no longer prisoners, but pioneers, building a new world, a new life, a new home, together.